I love the idea that you got a little preview from Dr. Jane about not wanting to be the last one at the bar and going on the offensive, because I think in many ways we could use those words as readily as I chose to use the words movement, market, metamorphosis for what we're going to talk about today. So in particular, we're going to focus on a handful of takeaways. We can understand markets having nothing to do with ours. And it's very insightful to learn unemotionally about how markets evolve. And I think it's really important that we take a step back from the daily work we do and appreciate that while we all want to be different, we're not as different as we think or want to be. And it's crucial, I think, today, from my perspective, if nothing else, people leave appreciating that S-curves aren't a business school thing. They're a day-to-day thing when you're leading an organization and imagining your strategic future. So how markets evolve is crucial. Our market evolved in no small part because of the efforts of you, your predecessors, and all those that can take credit for being the hospice movement. That having been said, the movement did evolve into a marketplace in somewhat quirky ways because of how the movement started, but nonetheless regressing to the mean, meaning the movement may have started far afield from markets, but we have moved into a marketplace world. And what happens in markets is they eventually metamorphosize. And so we're going to talk about where we are today, and in particular, the implications of the marketplace we're in into the future. So we're going to talk about why value-based care matters, and I'm going to show you a slide that I think typifies a great deal of misunderstanding about value-based programming. It's not coming, it's here. We haven't participated much, but everyone else in healthcare has. So value-based programming is here, not coming. And that's really crucial, I think, for all of us as we imagine what we can take away from our time together today as we go home. I'm going to make some comments about the evolving senior housing market and show you some data about how crucial that senior housing market is as we contemplate the evolution of end-of-life care. So we'll leave that for a couple of slides. And then finally, we're going to specifically talk about what does and might metamorphosis mean? What might it literally look like to be the last one at the bar? What might it literally look like if we think that we don't have to go on the offensive? My view is that there is no more influential group in end-of-life care in the country than those of you in the room today, but that's not a birthright. And in some ways, I am fearful that it's slipping away a little. Okay, let's talk about markets. It's entirely possible that markets can grow and mask real fundamental shifts in market share. That has happened for many of us in the room. The market can be growing 25%. We're ecstatic, we're growing 20%. Wise guys like me would say we're losing 5% market share every year. And it's really crucial not just to look at our history of growth, but to look at our position in a growing market. And that's measured by market share, not just year-over-year growth. And the nonprofit hospice community, let's just be blunt, has lost a terrific amount of market share over the last 2 decades. These are empirical facts. You may not like them. Don't get mad at me. It's data. We have lost share even as we have grown. It's often the case that market growth masks very important market segmentations, and I'm going to make a case for a couple of those as we talk today. Oftentimes, growth markets don't require efficiency. You can grow 12% and earnings can grow 6% and you're tickled by that. That means you're not being efficient. Market evolution almost always entails a switch from markets not rewarding efficiency to requiring it. We are now in the midst of an evolution where we have not been punished for lack of efficiency yet, but we will be, I think, now and going forward. Finally, and I think the most important part about understanding markets, when metamorphosis occurs, it rarely is led by incumbents. These are just realities. It's hard to disrupt yourself. The incumbents have the most at stake in the current world order. In many ways, it's why I am not particularly afraid of most of the big for-profit hospices. I think they are doubling down on fighting the last war. I think they're doing it incredibly well, but it is nonetheless the last war. The question is, who will be in charge of the metamorphosis? Markets can be represented on an S-curve. And maybe we'll agree to disagree. We're on the wrong side of this S-curve. We are at the peak and in many markets on the downslope. We are potentially becoming landline phone companies. I know, that's kind of an offensive analogy. Who's going to be the cell phone provider? That's the question. What happens in maturing markets is metamorphosis occurs and disrupts the incumbents. And oh, by the way, before everyone says to me, yeah, but we haven't peaked yet. The landline companies thought they hadn't peaked yet in the developing world. And when cell phones came, what happened? They were replaced before they ever were embedded. So metamorphosis can have an even more profound effect on markets than we think, because disruption can take root and profoundly alter what those markets look like. I said we'd talk about the movement. I had the good fortune to have breakfast with Samira this morning, and we were comparing notes about the movement, and each of our memories are pretty good, but fading nonetheless. And I think it's important to honor and respect and be driven by what got us all started, and at the same time not to have rose glasses about that. There would not be this meeting without a group of social entrepreneurs. They were not business entrepreneurs. The hospice movement was not a business plan-driven phenomenon. It was a social change-driven phenomenon. It was the essence of community organizing and people coming together to fix a problem. And interestingly, even from the beginning, many of the folks in the hospice movement didn't want to join the system that they thought was the problem. It's really interesting to go back and look at the history and think about what happened. What happened in Florida in 1979 really was the beginning of a seminal change. It was the beginning of becoming part of the system. That arguably was formalized most when the Medicare hospice benefit changed. It was also representative, even though we might not have thought about it back then, of at least the nascent beginnings of a marketplace. The Medicare hospice benefit was not passed out of the graciousness and goodness of the collective hearts of the first Reagan administration. It was the only social welfare benefit passed that time. And it wasn't because people just thought it was good. It's because there was math. The original hospice benefit was passed largely because a bipartisan group realized they thought they could cost justify it. So we were beginning a marketplace evolution even back then. And I don't think anyone is surprised by the characteristics of the hospice movement in the 1980s. This was largely cancer patients. It was almost exclusively patients living in their personal residence, meaning at home. And there was certainly, Tom was, or I guess I can call him Tommy now that he's broken our little thing. There was no such thing as sales in the 1980s. It was an offensive term, largely. The 90s saw the first real market segmentation, again, one of the definitions of this evolution from movement to marketplace. And the first and most profound market segmentation to this day related to the ability of hospices from a reimbursement perspective to provide care to residents of skilled nursing facilities. It fundamentally changed the economics of the nascent hospice movement and arguably began the hospice marketplace. There were very few for-hospice organizations in the early 90s, late 90s, but it was with the beginning of the ability to care for patients in skilled nursing facilities that the for-profit movement really began to gain speed. I don't think I have to belabor the point. If you look at the math, obviously caring for patients in congregate settings has tremendous economic benefit compared to taking care of people in their homes. But by the time this happened, the hospice movement was already 15 years in, almost 20 years in. And so one of the interesting evolutions in the marketplace was the for-profits that really began in the 90s and 2000s came in with a business model tailored for this market segmentation. We didn't. We still, my experience with many of you, have one size fits all in terms of a model of care. That is simply not how the for-profits look at taking care of patients in SNFs and ALFs. There is a fundamental market segmentation far more profound outside of this room than inside this room. And when I talk about trends in senior housing, you'll see what I think that is just so incredibly important. Clearly, everyone in the room appreciates from a profitability perspective, long-stay patients drive profitability. Here's a little test for you. Go back home. I know we spend most of our time talking about our low, median, and mean lengths of stay. Take a look at your live length of stay and take a look at the 10 or 15% of your patients that provide 40 to 50% of your days of care? Our economic model, oddly enough, isn't that different than the for-profits. They've managed to optimize it, but the bottom line is our economic efficiency is no less dependent on this market segmentation than theirs. Despite 20 years of growth, when I look at the second decade of the 2000s, there was yet another decade of strong growth, even in the face of very low increase in deaths. It's interesting. One of the fascinating conversations I've had with clients over the last 40 years is about the increase in annual deaths. In the 90s and early 2000s, deaths grew less than 1% a year. In the first decade of the 2000s, a little over 1%. In the last 10 years, about 1.5%. That's not the definition of a pell-mell growth market. We don't have an extraordinary increase in the underlying driver of market growth in this country. And when I show you some slides that deal with COVID, you realize we're in for some really rocky times in terms of the size of our market over the next couple of years. Clearly, it seemed like everyone and their uncle was going to open a hospice. And we keep thinking those days are done. In many ways, pushing the carve-out to 2030, I think, just means we're going to have a whole bunch of additional market entrants who try to optimize this segmentation model. Clearly, this segmentation model had a profound impact in terms of, take a look at the first bullet point. We now have a margin and mission distinction. Taking care of patients who live for 10 days coming out of the hospital is not a margin business. I don't need to tell any of you that. It's a mission business. It's why we're here. It's a legacy of the movement. It's the good that we can do. But don't underestimate or misunderstand the overall segmentation model. And because we've never faced price competition, differentiation is solely based on services. That's very unusual. Even in healthcare, which has not been terrifically price sensitive compared to other industries, talk to your friends in home medical equipment or home health. Would they tell you they've had to differentiate based on price? How about just nod your heads? Yes, they have, profoundly so. And so, unfortunately, because we've been growing and losing market share along the way, we nonetheless didn't have an imperative for more efficiency. And so I think what we're doing is we're dealing with this reality in terms of the economics of the hospice marketplace right now. And sure, I'm sure there's folks in the room that are outliers on this spread, but I'll bet you I'm pretty close to putting all of you into a bucket in terms of what your margins look like and what your indirect costs as a percent of gross revenue look like. In particular, the indirect as a percent of gross should be scary to you. I'm going to try to scare you about that. Because when the big guys having nothing to do with patient care, when the big guys as a result of rent and employee benefits and IT are spending 12 to 15% of gross on indirect, and we're spending double that, we're waking up with ankle weights on. We're coming to a race and we have ankle weights on. We've also done a variety of movement, mission-driven things without perhaps as much of a marketplace lens as we might have. Palliative care consult programs were never a business. I'll take the tomatoes. I'm sure a couple of you will tell me that you make money doing it. Great, I'd love to have at it with you. I'll double down. Palliative care consult programs have never been a business. And by the way, the beneficiary of palliative care consult programs has been hospitals. It was not the payer. The hospital optimized their DRG. They beat the crap out of us to help them do so. And we've done it. I'm not saying we didn't do well for patients. I'm simply saying let's be hard-ass economists about this. Let's be marketplace reality-based about this. This is what's happened. Palliative care consults has now become a cost of doing business in the hospice marketplace. That's what they are. I think we're going to have to make some really profound decisions going forward in terms of how much mission and how much margin do we have to think about, and are our historic best customers the best customers going forward? I do business with hospitals, so I have no desire to poke them in the eye. However, they're your biggest customer and your worst customer. I want you to think about this for a minute. If we were really doing what the movement set out to do, people wouldn't be going to the hospital and coming to us and dying in 7 days, or 1 day, or 7 hours, or 7 minutes. They'd be coming to us in lieu of that last hospitalization. And don't mistake how the money works. Are some of you surprised sometimes when you see cost effectiveness studies and short stay patients don't save Medicare money? That's because we're not often in lieu of the hospital, we're in addition to it. 50% of inpatients come to us from the hospital and die in that episode. That means Medicare paid the DRG and then paid us. That's an increase in cost. I work with MA plans not always representing some of you. Do you think they get that? Oh yeah, they get that. We are often a cost. Our best customer is not necessarily our best strategic partner thinking into the future. Finally, and I do mean to be provocative about this, if you'd asked me when I first met Tom what differentiation would look like in 2023, I'm embarrassed how wrong I would have been. I would have lost my house on the point on this slide. I would have said in the late 80s, early 90s, it can't take beyond 2000 for there to be a robust, quantitative marketplace of ideas and rankings about pain management. To this day, survey people about end-of-life care and hospice care and what's their immediate association with hospice and the value add and benefit, pain management. So yes, I am challenging you. Come up to me after the meeting and send me the stuff you use in the marketplace to show that your program provides better pain management than anybody else. I haven't seen it yet. I'm trying to take care of myself, so I live long enough. It's amazing to me. We fight about who gets to the hospital in an hour or 2 hours. Really, this is what differentiation has become? I think we have missed some really important opportunities in differentiation, and that means we have allowed an increasingly commoditized marketplace. In a commoditized marketplace, price is going to become more important. And if we also haven't had the imperative to be efficient over multiple decades, that's a bad spot. We are not ideally positioned for price competition, and I don't think we're ideally positioned for qualitative differentiation conversation. I mentioned we're on the wrong side of the S-curve. I think debt service ratios are peaking. I think length of stay is going to continue to come down. I think we are in the market maturity phase of the S-curve. In 2019, the last COVID year, the United States hit 50% of all Medicare decedents receiving hospice care at time of death. In some markets where I do work, the number is as high as 65%. I could make an elegant case for you that it could be 70. It's a perfect world that will never exist. A 70% death service ratio means that literally everyone who has cancer decides they don't want to be in a clinical trial. These are just sort of fantastical numbers. High 60s is realistically the highest we're ever going to see. And I think we're beginning to see pushback in some of those markets. So I think we just have to embrace the idea that this is a jump the S-curve market. This is about continuing to be the landline company and also developing new businesses that jump the S-curve. Because if we don't, the reality of markets will in fact prevail. It always does. And by the way, I won't be here for your panel that follows mine. I'm not arguing that there are bad actors in our space. Of course there are. Guess what? That's part of what happens in a marketplace. But all in all, this has been an incredibly good 4 decades for patients. And I think the bottom line is we shouldn't lose sight of the overwhelming majority of Americans are well served by hospice. And I think we should just be cautious about yelling too loudly about the inefficiencies of the market. All markets have some inefficiencies. I love this slide because it shows in one busy page, value-based is here. So look at the top. It shows 65 million folks in Medicare. Almost all the numbers on here are basically real time. Medicare makes this data available with some variability, but only 22 million out of 65 million Americans are in traditional Medicare fee-for-service. When folks tell you value-based is coming, tell them they're wrong. Value-based is here. 30 million folks are in MA, another 13 million are in ACOs. Value-based is here. The growth in Medicare Advantage is profound, and another day it would be valuable to talk in particular about dual eligible special needs plans and the highly integrated, fully integrated, and coordination-only variants of D-SNPs, but I think all of you should invest the time in understanding the segmentation model inside Medicare Advantage, because the I-SNPs and D-SNPs in particular are going to offer alternatives to what we've historically viewed as the only appropriate form of end-of-life care, which is hospice. Busy slide. I'm going to get you the slide, so don't feel like you're taking the eye test on this slide. What this shows you is where people die in America. And on the bottom, you can see the dramatic increase in deaths that I referenced a moment ago. That's the impact of COVID. We've gone from an increase of an expected 1.5% new mortalities to 19%. What that means is in years 24, 5, 6, we're going to have a real decline over 2021 and 22 in number of deaths. Our market is going to shrink over the next few years rather profoundly. We have pulled forward deaths from the rest of this decade into the first few years of this decade. The real point of this slide, though, is to show you the number of people that die in long-term care facilities and hospice units. Hospice units nationally, you'll see, is about 6%. It's under 1% in California and 21% in Florida. It's sort of hard to fathom that, isn't it? But take a look at long-term care, because I want you to have as a takeaway the profound importance of 1% of the population on everything we do as end-of-life care providers. So less than 0.5% of the population of the United States lives in SNFs and assisted living, and yet it's just under 30% of all deaths, and right now, 50% of your days of care. Let's repeat that. 1% of the population is almost 30% of deaths and almost 50% of our days of care. And to the extent that any of you have money left in the shoebox at the end of the month, it's because of this 50% of your days of care, not the other 50%. So you should be fixated on all things senior housing. I don't want to spend too much time about the potential carve-in, but I do just want to note some statistical facts about the carve-out, because I think it's often misunderstood. Medicare Advantage plans like us now and will continue to in a carve-out world, not because they've decided we're cost-effective. Here's how the math works. They decide if we're getting paid $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 a month for a patient, this is almost a reinsurance conversation from their perspective. They decide at that point, gee, what are the odds that Mr. Benjamin is going to cost me more than a couple of $1,000s in the last couple of months? And so when I take a look at average length of stays coming from Medicare Advantage plans, it's 60, 70 days. They're pretty good referral sources. Let's not mistake that for them having decided hospice is cost effective. Cost effective would mean if they had to pay us $6,000 a month, and their other options included home health or supportive care programs, that would be a cost effectiveness conversation. Carve-out math simply means they're deciding, might the patient cost them more than their reimbursement? These are very different math equations. And if you talk to the folks who run supportive care programs for the big MA plans, they don't want to refer a patient at 6 months because they think they can make money on that patient. If you talk to the folks at Prospero, who, by the way, take care of 30,000 patients, everyone got that? A company started in 2019, has 50% more palliative care patients than Vitas has hospice patients, just inside United Healthcare. That's because they think they can do a very good job managing patients in months 3 through 12 without using hospice. We need to be really clear-eyed about what these folks are thinking. We also need to do some homework. It'd be worth an hour another day to go into institutional special needs plans. These are the folks that come into skilled nursing facilities and provide care for that population only. If you think back to the slide a couple minutes ago, they're up to 107,000 enrollment on a base of 1.5 million, growing 5 to 10% a year. But I think what's really happening is you're seeing nursing home owners open their own I-SNPs because the Medicaid room and board model is broken. And so what I think that takes us to is an inflection point, not because of any one thing. I had lots of clients tell me, well, aren't you relieved the carve-out's been postponed till 2030? I said, sure, now there's only 7 things I'm worried about instead of 8. And I think that's the perspective we ought to have, because overall market maturity And the S-curve, for me, in a lot of ways, transcends whether the carve-in out occurs this year, next year. It's going to happen. In the meantime, organizations like United use Prospero to manage our length of stay. It's not going to be 6-month length of stay from them. I don't know how many of you work with ACOs, but they increasingly, as they mature, ACOs have only been around for a decade, they increasingly view us as a cost, not an investment, a cost. Talk to ACOs about their hospice spend. Wow. Again, happy to share some offline experiences with you working with ACOs around the country. I think we're in for a very interesting couple of years as the REACH program in particular grows, because remember, the REACH program is not only carved in, but they can ask us for a discount, and they're going to increasingly do that. We're going to talk in a minute about focused frail elder physician care practices who are evolving from fee-for-service practices to value-based practices. They too, when they do that, all of a sudden view hospice as a potential cost to be managed. So I think it's really crucial we understand what's going on with those practices. Again, I don't think we need to spend time on this. The carve-in is X number of years out, but I would encourage you to just go through the slide. I think you'll conclude there's nothing particularly good that will come from the carve-in. I think we're arguing about just how bad it might be, but again, that particular bullet isn't coming at us from a gun this moment. MSSP and REACH ACOs are here now, and they now have 13 million enrollment. I really encourage you to go home and find out who the ACOs are in your marketplace, because I promise you someone is or will soon be looking at hospice as an expense. And it's super important you get inside them to appreciate how they're viewing that. I do a lot of work with PACE programs. Many of you in the room own PACE programs. PACE programs have never been hospice referral sources. That's not because they don't love you. It's because they have a model of care that they think does a fine job taking care of patients in a longitudinal primary care model, much like iSNPs. If your mom was in a PACE program, I think you'd have a great experience. If your mom was in an iSNP, I think you'd have a great experience. In both instances, there isn't this burning bush moment where hospice is chosen. There's 2 to 3 years of longitudinal primary care, very hands-on, relationship-oriented, where the provider is taking care of the patient and just doesn't think it makes sense to hand over professional management responsibility of the patient for their last 30 or 60 days of life. And I think it's just really important, if you're not close to a PACE program, find a colleague here while you're here and learn about what they do. I touched on frail elder physician practices. What I mean are the groups in your markets that are the docs that go to people's homes to care for them there, or that are the attendings in skilled nursing facilities and assisted living. There is a land grab going on at the moment among value-based aggregators, ACO operators, to find relationships with these groups. The average Medicare beneficiary spends about $10,000 or $11,000 a year on healthcare. That's the average. That means a whole bunch of us are $1,000, $2,000. The average nursing home resident spends about $25,000 a year on healthcare. Not unusual for the spend to be $40,000. So value-based programs have gone from wanting to avoid the really costly patients to exactly the opposite, and trying to figure out how can they enroll them in value-based programs because they think there's an incredible opportunity. We've talked about senior housing. The model is broken. Talk about a metamorphosis and inflection point. I think we're going to see more change in senior housing over the next 24 months than we have in 24 years. We're going to continue to see ACO enrollment. We're going to continue to see iSNP growth. In any and all cases, these patients are going to be longitudinally managed because there's too big an opportunity to save money for anything else to happen. The enhancing oncology model isn't out yet, I think any minute, but the bottom line is we have seen the first metamorphosis as a result of the oncology care model. Sure, CMMI eliminated the model, but not because a handful of people didn't save money. And I think the bottom line is there were enough participants in OCM who genuinely saved Medicare money that we're going to see real participation in the enhancing oncology model. And you can just read the last bullet point. I think we're going to see evolving models that will look more like iSNP and PACE, where oncology practices are going to have to embrace the idea that they can't just offload a patient the last 30 or 60 days of life. And I think it's going to be up to us to figure out how we're embedded inside those groups as their partner, not as a vendor at the last minute. So that brings us to the end. It brings us to the who's the last one at the bar? Are we going to go on the offensive? I think everyone in this room has to achieve scale. And I think there's a handful of you in the room that are positioned to do it right now. So yes, I mean to be provocative about that. I think you literally cannot continue on the same economic model. The bottom line is, I think you're going to have relationships with others. So invest more time in the conversation you're having at the table. That person needs to be your business partner, not just your friend. And I think that that's a big part of what can come out of this meeting, this group, the relationships you've all built. I think you're also going to have to rethink your entire product and service line vision. Do you want to be the landline company? It's a choice. And I think the proof of that will be pretty soon. Do you describe yourself as an organization that has hospice or a hospice that has other service lines? That's not semantics. That's a profoundly important strategic reckoning. My advice, my wish is that you get your arms around imagining that you're going to be an organization that has a hospice, not a hospice that has other service lines. And so the bottom line is, whether disruptor or disrupted is a choice. But it's the choice that Dr. John presented to you. If you're not on the offensive, you're on the defensive. There's no place in the middle. If you're not taking the lead in these conversations, things are happening to you. You just don't recognize how much of it. So, I think you're the most important group in the country in terms of end-of-life care. I honestly, genuinely believe that. The question is, will you be in 5 years? Because you don't have a birthright to that. And the S-curve spares no one. So, it's a choice. Are you willing to disrupt yourselves, or do you want to be the landline company? Thank you very much for the time. Appreciate it.